Okay, so our project focused on San Diego restaurant analysis, and we did some background research first to kind of get an idea of if there had been prior research done on this topic, and there had been some done in other cities as well as in San Diego, but it focused mainly on just star rating and not sentiment analysis. And so we kind of used this as a jumping off point and wanted to also include Yelp API, use Yelp API Fusion to get some sentiment analysis from Yelp reviews on the restaurants in our data set to be able to have some qualitative and quantitative stats on our restaurants to be able to get a more nuanced interpretation of the opinions on restaurants in San Diego. And our goal was to identify which cuisine types are the rated highest overall. And this builds on prior studies that only looked at five-star frequency. So our main research question was what cuisines receive highest ratings in San Diego. Our hypothesis was that Italian restaurants, due to their relatively high frequency overall, would have higher average ratings. Our thought process on this was that because there is such a big market for Italian restaurants to do so well in San Diego, and there's so many of them, there must be some sort of underlying preference for that. And because of that, they must be rated higher on average. And so this was kind of our reasoning behind our hypothesis and our research question. So our first step was to look for a comprehensive list of all San Diego restaurants. In our ideal data set, we would have access to a list that has everything, and then from there be able to sample about 10% of restaurants we thought would be sufficient to be able to get a good idea of the population overall. However, in practice, finding a source that contained a list of all restaurants in San Diego was much harder to do. And so we went from a list on the San Diego City website that has a list of all businesses that in the last month have filed for their business license, which is required for every business and must be renewed every year. And so this is kind of our version of getting a random sample because there is no underlying correlation between a business and its characteristics and when it files for or renews its license. And so this is all random, which is great and something that we really want in our sample. However, it did, once we narrowed down, because it is all businesses, once we did some data cleaning and got just restaurants and only the zip codes we cared about, which would be all zip codes in San Diego, our data set was very small, but we cleaned and standardized cuisine names and then filtered for only restaurants and only for San Diego. And then that ended up with 79 restaurants overall, which again is a pretty small sample size, which made it a bit hard to generalize our results. The next step was to do some EDA, and the key findings from this were that the most common cuisines were Mexican, coffee shops, American, Chinese, and Italian. And the most highly rated ones were health food stores, acai, and ice cream. However, it is important to note that these restaurants were not very frequent in our data. I think health food stores and acai both had one or two instances of restaurants in our data set. So this is, again, really hard to base general ideas on what is the most highly rated based off one restaurant. And so that is a limitation of our data set. Ratings roughly were normally distributed with most around 4 stars. So there's a big spike overall of 4-star ratings. And in cuisines, we looked at most common and most highly rated and the distributions for those cuisines specifically. And there was also usually a spike around 4 or 4.5 we found was pretty common in our data. And the zip code distribution showed clustering around downtown and Del Cerro. So this just gives us an idea of how generalizable our data will be because different areas in San Diego are very unique and have very different demographics in terms of types of cuisine and preferences for cuisine and everything like that. And so generalizing based off a data set that has a really strong geospatial kind of distribution in these two neighborhoods is something important to consider. And then going away to our key takeaways from EDA was that Mexican cuisine dominates in volume, but is not always the dominant in average rating. Italian has fewer restaurants, but often higher ratings, and some zip codes are overrepresented in our data set. And then after this, we moved on to doing a hypothesis test to kind of see if there's any statistical significance that would support our hypothesis. And we found first, we compared average restaurant ratings between Italian and non-Italian. So we grouped by that in our data and then performed a hypothesis test, which the p-value was not statistically significant. So this just means that there is not strong evidence that Italian cuisine overall is more highly rated compared to all other types of foods in San Diego. Some possible reasons for this is that we had a really small sample size. So maybe if we collected more data, we'd be able to find this pattern in the data. We don't know. Varied expectations. Italian is really common. If people kind of have higher expectations for Italian than other cuisines, they might rate it more harshly, and that could also contribute to our findings. And rating bias. We found that most common is not the most highly rated. As we can see in the plots, acai ice cream and health food stores are the most common. And the plot below, we can see, or I'm sorry, those are the most highly rated. The plot below shows the most common, and these don't really seem to line up. And again, this could be due more so to do with the fact that the most highly rated ones tended to be the ones that were less common, and they're based off fewer instances of a cuisine type. And this could be the kind of driving factor in why this is the case. Novelty cuisines like acai rated higher despite being less common. Italian cuisine did not validate our hypothesis, and ratings skew positively but show variance across cuisines. Some limitations and next steps. Our sample size was really small, which limits generalizability. There's an uneven geographic distribution. Sentiment analysis could provide richer insights. However, we weren't able to gather sentiment analysis through Yelp API scraping, unfortunately. So this would be something that would be great in a future study. And then future work would be to scrape more data so that we have a larger sample size, analyze review text, and control for bias. And that would really enrich our findings and maybe be able to find some sort of relationship between what we hypothesized, Italian restaurants, and higher ratings. But because our sample size was so small and there are a lot of confounding factors in our data that we kind of thought might be present, it was really hard to find any really strong relationship for what we thought would be present in the data.